In the twilight of an empire, when palaces turned into prisons and crowns became shackles, the Romanovs, once rulers of the largest realm on earth, were reduced to whispers behind barred windows. This is not only the story of Nicholas II, the last Tsar, or Alexandra, the doomed empress. It is the story of a family clinging to faith, to love, and to each other, even as the tide of revolution closed in. Tonight, we descend into the silence of the house of special purpose, where loyalty met betrayal, where innocence was extinguished by gunfire, and where 300 years of monarchy ended in a single night. Stay with us until the very end, to understand not just how the Romanovs fell, but why their shadows still haunt history. I was not born to the marble halls of the Winter Palace, nor to the golden rooms of Tsarskoye Selo. I was born in a village of dirt floors and hungry winters, where the only gold I ever saw was in the light of sunrise upon frost. And yet, by fate or folly, I found myself in the service of the Romanovs, the family that claimed the crown of all Russia, the family the world called divine. I washed their linens, carried their meals, polished the boots of the Tsar himself. I was no more than a shadow in their great life of ritual and splendor. But in the end, it was I, a humble servant, who walked with them into the darkness of Ekaterinburg, who stood in that cellar when the empire fell. History remembers Nicholas II as the last Tsar, Alexandra as the doomed empress, their children as tragic innocents, but history does not remember us. The nameless ones who cooked their meals, brushed their hair, whispered comfort to them in the night. We were not kings, not saints, not executioners. We were witnesses. And I, who once carried their candlesticks, in palaces lit with crystal chandeliers, found myself carrying their pillows into a house that smelled of damp and despair, the house of special purpose. When they brought us there in chains, we did not yet know it would be our tomb. The city outside churned with the noise of revolution, banners waving red, men shouting slogans of equality and vengeance. But inside the walls of Ipatiev House there was only silence, broken by the whispers of the family I had served all my life. The Tsar, once the little father of Russia, now walked like a tired man in ill-fitting boots. The Tsarina, once radiant in jewels, clutched a small icon with hands trembling from illness. The 4 grand duchesses, no longer in silk, gowns, sewed and mended their own clothes by candlelight. And the boy, Alexei, sweet, sickly, fragile, limped across the floor on unsteady legs, his eyes still carrying the spark of childhood, though he was caged like an animal. I tell you this, there is no tragedy more haunting than to watch those, born to rule, reduced to prisoners in their own land. To see the splendor of Romanov bloodline hidden behind barred windows and locked doors. To hear the daughters of the Tsar giggling softly as they braided each other's hair, trying to forget. The sound of guards' boots outside. They were not symbols to me. They were flesh. They were family. They were children who asked me to tell them stories at night to drown out their fear. And yet, every day, the shadow of doom grew longer. We servants whispered of trials, of executions, of exile to Siberia. But none of us dared tell them the truth, that their empire was already dead, and the new world had no place for them. The Bolsheviks said we were equal now, that there would be no Tsar, no empress, no throne. But I, who had polished the crown, who had set the table with golden plates, knew that some bloodlines cannot vanish quietly. They must be drowned in gunfire, and ash to make sure the world believes it. And so I remained with them, out of loyalty or perhaps out of fear, as they prayed in whispers and waited for a mercy that would never come. I stayed because someone had to carry their secrets into the grave. Someone had to witness the night when Russia's crown was shattered, not in a palace of marble, but in a cellar of brick and blood. This is my story, and theirs, a story not of kings and conquests, but of captivity, of faith tested and betrayed, of the moment when the Romanovs fell, not as sovereigns, but as a family huddled together in the dark, waiting for the sound of boots on the stairs. I was born in the winter of 1892, in a village that barely deserved a name, on the flat earth of the Volga, where snow covered everything so thoroughly it seemed the world itself had been swallowed in white silence. My father was a cooper who patched barrels for a landlord. My mother spun wool with hands cracked from frost. We owned nothing but our breath, our bodies, and the small hut that shook whenever the wind howled across the fields. Hunger was the first companion of my childhood, cold the second. Yet in those years, despite the hardship, there was faith. Faith that the Tsar in distant St. Petersburg was our father, that his gaze, though far, watched over us. Little father, the villagers called him. When my own father beat me, when I went to bed with an empty stomach, I whispered prayers to that faraway sovereign, believing he would send angels to protect me. By the time I turned 12, the angels had not come. My father died of fever, my mother of grief not long after. Orphans like me were many, and most sank into the earth unremembered. But I had something others did not. I was quick with my hands and quiet with my tongue. When the steward of a local noble came through the village seeking servants for the city, I was chosen. That journey, rattling in a cart across frozen roads, was my first glimpse beyond the borders of our village. And when the domes of St. Petersburg pierced the horizon, shimmering in gold and green against the grey sky, I thought I had entered heaven itself. At first, I served in a minor house, scrubbing floors, carrying water, fetching wood. The nobles hardly looked at me, but I watched them with awe. Their lives seemed another species altogether. Velvet drapes, porcelain cups, laughter that echoed beneath, chandeliers. Yet I also saw their cruelty, the way they scolded a maid for spilling a drop of wine, the way they dismissed servants as though we were furniture. I learned to keep my head bowed, my words few, my hands swift. A servant survives not through strength, but through invisibility. It was there, through sheer chance, that I was noticed by a court official seeking new attendants for Tsarskoye Selo. They wanted fresh faces, obedient and discreet. My youth and silence suited them. I was barely 16 when I first entered the gilded halls of the Alexandra Palace, where Nicholas II and his family resided. My knees shook so violently I thought I would collapse on the marble floor, but I learned quickly how to carry myself with deference, how to dress a table until it gleamed like a holy altar, how to step without sound across endless corridors. Serving the Romanovs was nothing like serving provincial nobility. They were at once more simple and more impossible. The Tsar, Nicholas, was a man of short stature, but of immense aura, quiet, almost shy, with eyes that seemed forever distant. He would thank me softly when I poured his tea, yet his presence reminded me always that here stood the sovereign of all Russia, the autocrat whose word was law. Alexandra, the empress, was different, fierce in her love for her children, suspicious of outsiders, her gaze sharp as glass. Many servants feared her temper, but I saw in her a woman consumed by worry, her hands always trembling when her son, Alexei, fell ill. It was the children, though, who marked me most. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, the 4 grand duchesses, were luminous beings, half princesses, half children, giggling in corridors, whispering secrets, yet bowing with practiced grace when their mother entered the room. And Alexei, the Tsarevich, was the center of all, pale, frail, often confined to bed with bleeding that no doctor could stop, yet with a spirit so bright it seemed to mock his suffering. I remember once carrying a tray of sweets into the nursery, and he, though barely able to walk, snatched one with a grin and said, "Do not tell Mama." In that moment, I did not see a prince, but simply a boy, eager for mischief. My life became bound to theirs. I rose before dawn, laid out their garments, polished their boots until they shone, carried their meals upon golden trays. I was there when they celebrated feast days with fireworks that lit the palace gardens, and I was there when they wept silently behind closed doors after Alexei's attacks of pain. I was a shadow in their lives, unseen, unnoticed, yet always present. But presence brings knowledge. I heard the whispers in the palace about Rasputin, the peasant mystic who seemed to ease Alexei's suffering. I saw the empress clasp his hands with desperate reverence, saw the disgust in the faces of courtiers who called him charlatan and devil. I carried linens past doors, where ministers muttered about strikes and protests in the streets of St. Petersburg, about the empire trembling beneath the weight of war. The Romanovs lived in splendor, yet even I, a servant, could sense the cracks spreading through their world. Still, as a youth, I believed their glory eternal. I believed the Tsar's throne as immovable as the mountains, his power as divine as the icons that hung in the palace chapels. And when I lay at night upon my thin servant's mattress, I thought myself blessed beyond measure to serve them. I had risen from a hut of dirt to the house of emperors. What greater fortune could God grant a boy like me? I did not yet know that this fortune was a curse in disguise. For to serve the Romanovs was to share their fate. To walk behind them in corridors was to walk behind them into captivity. To hold their garments was to hold their shrouds. I, who thought myself invisible, would one day be made a witness to their very end. But that lay in the future. In those early years, I was still forming, still learning the delicate dance of servitude, still convincing myself that their world was unshakable. The irony was cruel. Just as I came of age in the service of the Romanovs, the Romanov dynasty itself was beginning its descent toward ruin. From the shadowed alcoves of the Alexandra palace, I witnessed the Romanovs at their height, still radiant in power, still cloaked in the aura of divine right. To serve them was to live in a world split in two, the golden surface of imperial splendor and the dark undercurrent of unrest that lapped against the palace walls like a tide no one dared name. I was young and dazzled, and so I clung to the glittering surface. But beneath it, cracks were widening, and I, though only a servant, could feel the tremor in the marble. Every morning began with ceremony. The Tsar's boots polished to mirror, shine, his uniform pressed with precision, his beard combed neatly before he emerged for prayers. His presence in the chapel was quiet but commanding. Even his silence carried the weight of centuries. When he walked the palace halls, soldiers snapped to attention, servants bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the ground. To me, Nicholas was less a man than an icon, an extension of the sacred images that lined the gilded walls of the palace church. He embodied the Romanov name, which for 300 years had ruled Russia like an unbroken chain from heaven. The Empress Alexandra, by contrast, radiated not authority but devotion. She was consumed by her role as mother, hovering always over her fragile son, Alexei. Her eyes, fierce and anxious, saw both everything and nothing. She noticed the crease in a daughter's gown, the slight pallor of the Tsarevich's cheeks, but seemed blind to the whispers of unrest echoing through the streets beyond the palace gates. I often thought of her as a woman torn in two, empress to millions, but mother to one sickly boy whose every spasm of pain shook her faith. The four Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, were the heart of the household. They carried themselves with the grace expected of royalty, but in private they laughed, sang, teased each other with the unguarded joy of youth. I carried trays to their rooms and often found them huddled together on the floor, sewing garments for soldiers at the front, their fingers pricked and raw, yet still smiling. They were sheltered, yet not heartless. They knew their people suffered, but they believed their prayers and charity would suffice. They did not understand, as few of us did, that charity cannot stem a revolution. At that time, Russia still bowed to the Tsar as to a father. In Easter processions, peasants knelt on roadsides as the imperial carriage passed, making the sign of the cross as though Christ himself rode within. In the winter palace, balls glittered with jewels and silk. Foreign dignitaries bent low, and orchestras filled the halls with music so grand it seemed to shake the very heavens. To be in service, then, was to be surrounded by splendor that blinded the eyes and deafened the ears. One forgot the smell of hunger in the villages, the cries of workers demanding bread, the distant rumble of unrest. Within those walls, it was still 1812, still 1700, still a Russia where the Tsar's word was eternal. And yet, even in the height of that power, I saw signs of rot. I saw ministers come and go with unnatural speed, dismissed on the whisper of Rasputin. I saw the empress bow before that ragged peasant, clutching his hand with trembling reverence as though he were her true confessor. I saw courtiers sneer. Behind their hands, nobles roll their eyes, yet none dared confront her faith in him, for his presence calmed the Tsarevich's bleeding, and that was all that mattered. I carried wine into rooms where officers muttered about strikes in St. Petersburg, about workers beaten in the streets, about soldiers returning from the front without boots, without rifles. But these whispers never reached the imperial table. There, conversations circled around family, around faith, around the conviction that Russia's soul was too strong to falter. I remember vividly the day war was declared in 1914. The bells of St. Petersburg rang. Crowds filled the streets with banners and hymns, crying out, "God save the Tsar!" From the palace balcony, Nicholas addressed them, his voice steady, his eyes distant. The people roared with adoration, believing him invincible. The empress clasped Alexei to her chest, whispering that God would protect his father and the empire. In that moment, the Romanovs seemed unassailable, their faith a fortress, their people devoted unto death. And yet, I, standing behind the curtain, saw in the Tsar's eyes not triumph, but weariness, as though he knew the weight of the crown was already too heavy. As the war dragged on, the palace grew quieter, more strained. Letters arrived from the front, soaked in despair. Wounded soldiers filled the hospitals, and the Grand Duchesses tended to them, their soft hands learning the harshness of blood and bandages. I watched Anastasia laugh with a soldier missing half his leg, and for a moment, the war seemed almost noble. But when I left the palace to visit the city, I saw bread lines stretching for hours, women crying as their children starved, men cursing the Tsar's name. Two worlds, inside, devotion and faith. Outside, hunger and rage. Yet still, within the palace, the aura of the Romanovs endured. Their fame was not measured in politics or policy, but in myth. They were the anointed family, the link between heaven and earth, the keepers of Russia's fate. To the people, Nicholas was the little father, Alexandra the devout mother, their children innocent angels. To me they were flesh, flawed yet luminous, blind yet radiant. And in serving them, I became part of that myth, carried along in its glow. But fame is fragile, it is built on faith, and faith, once broken, does not mend. Even as the Romanovs glowed in their gilded world, shadows gathered in the streets. And I, though only a servant, began to sense that the songs sung in their honor were turning into whispers of betrayal. They did not hear it. Not yet. But I did, and I knew that the height of their power was only the steepness of the fall that awaited them. I remember the day when the grandeur began to fade, not with the sound of trumpets, but with the echo of hunger in the streets. By 1916, the war had devoured Russia like a beast insatiable. Millions of soldiers dead, villages emptied, families starving. In St. Petersburg, which they renamed Petrograd to rid it of German taint, the people no longer raised banners of devotion, but fists of fury. And in the palace, though the chandeliers still glowed, the air thickened with dread. The Romanovs, once adored as living saints, were now cursed as demons who fed on the blood of their children. I, a servant, moved through corridors where whispers clung to the walls like cobwebs, whispers of revolution, whispers of betrayal. Nicholas, the Tsar, bore the burden with a silence that was both noble and damning. He was not cruel, not monstrous. He was simply paralyzed, as if the weight of 3 centuries of Romanov glory had crushed the marrow from his bones. He left for the front to command the army, believing his presence would inspire. But in truth, it only deepened the empire's ruin. In his absence, Alexandra ruled, and with her, Rasputin. I saw the Empress clasp his hands in candlelit rooms, begging him to pray for Alexei's fragile body. I saw Rasputin's eyes gleam with the confidence of one who knew he held not only the fate of a child, but of an empire. Ministers came and went like reeds in a storm, dismissed or appointed at his whisper. Courtiers muttered of corruption, of scandal, of a throne corrupted by a peasant's touch. The Romanovs believed him sent by God. The people believed him sent by the devil. In those days, the palace felt like a fortress under siege, though the enemy was not yet outside with rifles, but inside with hunger and contempt. Servants disappeared, quietly, their loyalty snapped by the lure of bread and safety. Guards who once saluted with pride now did so with sullen eyes. Even we, the invisible ones, felt the current shift. There were nights when I carried meals to the imperial dining room and heard the distant roar of mobs beyond the gates, chanting not prayers but curses. Alexandra wept in silence. Nicholas bowed his head over his plate and said nothing. The grand duchesses tried to smile, but even their youth could not banish the shadow. Then came February of 1917. Snow fell in sheets, yet still the people filled the streets, demanding bread, demanding peace, demanding the Tsar's abdication. I saw smoke rising from factories, soldiers refusing to fire upon the crowds, banners of red unfurled in defiance. Within the palace, panic rippled. Nicholas was away at the front, Alexandra helpless, her letters frantic, begging him to return. But by the time he did, it was too late. His own generals pressed him, ministers betrayed him, the Duma turned its back. And so, in a railway carriage, far from the marble of his throne, Nicholas II signed his abdication. The autocrat of all Russia became a man with no crown. I was there when he returned to his family, no longer Tsar, but simply Nicholas Alexandrovich. He held Alexandra close, kissed his daughters, knelt beside Alexei. His words were calm, but his eyes were hollow, as if he had already seen the gallows. From that moment, we were prisoners. The palace was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage. Guards stood at every door, rifles glinting. The family's jewels were locked away, their letters intercepted, their world shrunk to a handful of rooms. And I, bound by loyalty, chose to remain. Our captivity deepened with each passing month. First Tsarskoye Selo, then Tobolsk in the cold, Siberian air, where the family bore the indignities of prisoners with a grace that shamed their captors. They sewed their own clothes, baked their own bread, scrubbed their own floors. I helped them as best I could, but the humiliation was constant. Soldiers mocked them openly, shouting insults, laughing at the once proud daughters of Russia as they carried buckets of water. Alexandra prayed more fervently than ever, clinging to her icons as if they were lifelines. Nicholas chopped wood with his own hands, his frame stooped, his beard unkempt, a king reduced to peasant. The children tried to preserve fragments of joy, reading books aloud, playing simple games. But even their laughter sounded fragile, like glass ready to shatter. And always, the threat grew closer. Letters from sympathizers spoke of possible rescue, of loyalists gathering strength. The family's hopes rose, only to collapse when word came that the White Army faltered, that the Bolsheviks advanced. Alexandra's eyes grew darker each day, as though she saw the shadow of the end looming. Nicholas, ever silent, only once said to me in a quiet moment, "They do not want me alive, but God willing, my children may yet see another dawn." His voice did not tremble, but I saw the wetness in his eyes. By the spring of 1918, we were moved again to Ekaterinburg, to the house of Ipatiev, what they called the House of Special Purpose. The irony of the name did not escape us. Its walls were thick, its windows barred, its rooms stifling. There was no grandeur left. The Romanovs, once the rulers of the largest empire on earth, now lived like paupers, their meals meager, their walks confined to a small yard. The guards grew crueler, mocking the Grand Duchesses, jeering at Alexandra, making coarse jokes about Rasputin even after his death. I wanted to strike them, to silence their venom, but I could not. I was only a servant, as powerless as those I served. And yet, even in captivity, they remained dignified. Nicholas rose each morning, shaved, and greeted the guards with a nod as though he were still their sovereign. Alexandra insisted on prayers each night, her voice trembling but resolute. The children wrote letters, tended the small garden, whispered songs in the dark. In their endurance, they clung to the belief that they were not forgotten, that the world still remembered their crown, their faith, their bloodline. I knew better. I saw the rage in the eyes of the soldiers, heard the venom in their whispers. I knew that rescue would not come, that the revolution would not rest while even a drop of Romanov blood remained. The downfall was complete. From gilded palaces to a damp house in Ekaterinburg, from worshipped sovereigns to despised prisoners. And I, who had polished their crowns and carried their candles, now polished their meagre plates and carried buckets of slop. Yet I could not abandon them. For though history would call them symbols, to me they were flesh and blood, a family, clinging to each other in the darkness, and I knew, I felt it in my bones, that the storm had not yet reached its full fury. The end would not be exile. The end would be blood. It was the night of July 16th, 1918, though by the time the clock crept toward the hour of death, all sense of time had dissolved. The House of Special Purpose had been restless for days. Guards whispering in corners, footsteps heavier on the stairs, faces harder than before. I had learned to read silence in those months, and silence spoke loudest that night. It pressed against the walls, it filled the halls, it clung to my skin like cold sweat. Something final was coming. The family, though prisoners, clung to routine. That evening, Nicholas played a game of patience with cards worn at the edges. Alexandra sat nearby, stroking Alexei's hair as he leaned against her chair, pale and frail, but still smiling faintly at his sister's jokes. Olga read aloud a psalm, her voice steady though her hands trembled on the page. Tatiana, calm as always, sewed a torn sleeve. Maria hummed softly as she embroidered, while Anastasia, restless, teased the guards with mischievous quips that made her sisters laugh and their mother frown. In that fragile moment, it was almost possible to pretend they were still a family in peace, that the walls did not close in, that beyond the windows, a world had not turned against them. I busied myself with small tasks, straightening their meagre belongings, folding blankets, pouring water, anything to avoid the dread gnawing in my stomach. Yet every glance at the guards confirmed what I feared. They would not meet our eyes. Their boots struck the floor with unusual purpose. And then, close to midnight, the command came. The family was to be moved for their safety. We servants knew better. The whites were advancing, yes, but there would be no escape, no rescue, no safe haven. Still, Nicholas accepted the order with his usual calm. He woke his daughters gently, helped Alexandra to her feet, and carried Alexei in his arms when the boy's legs faltered. Together we descended the stairs, the air growing colder, damper, heavier with each step. The guards led us to a small basement room with low ceilings and bare walls. A single bulb flickered weakly above. 2 chairs had been set in the center, and Nicholas placed Alexandra and Alexei there, while the daughters stood clustered close. I lingered near the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought they would hear it. The commandant, Yurovsky, entered, with a slip of paper in his hand. His face was carved from stone. He looked at the Tsar, and in a voice flat as iron, read the sentence, "Nicholas Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives continue their offensive against Soviet, Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." For a moment, silence. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nicholas blinked, bewildered. "What?" he asked softly, as though he had misheard. Alexandra crossed herself, whispering, "God's will be done." Olga gasped, covering her mouth. Anastasia whimpered. And Alexei, poor, sickly Alexei, looked from face to face, too young to grasp what had been spoken, but old enough to sense its terror. Then the doors opened wider, and the room filled with men bearing rifles and revolvers. I felt the air sucked from my lungs. The family clutched one another, instinctively forming a circle of flesh and love against the storm of bullets about to fall. Nicholas straightened, placing himself in front of his wife and son, his eyes steady now. He was Tsar once more. Not crowned, not robed, but still sovereign in dignity. The command was given. The guns roared. The first volley shook the walls, deafened my ears, filled the room with smoke and screams. Nicholas fell where he stood, blood bursting from his chest. Alexandra slumped in her chair, her hands still clutching her icon. Olga and Tatiana collapsed almost at once, their prayers cut short. Maria stumbled, gasping, her eyes wide in disbelief. Anastasia shrieked, her voice piercing through the gunfire, as she darted toward the wall before shots struck her down. But it was not swift, not merciful. The Grand Duchesses had sewn jewels into their corsets, hoping to hide the family fortune. Those jewels, hard as armor, deflected bullets. The girls writhed on the floor, wounded but not dead, screaming as the gunmen cursed and reloaded. The air grew thick with gunpowder, with the stench of blood and fear. I pressed myself against the wall, paralyzed, my throat locked against a cry. Alexei, fragile Alexei, had slumped in his chair, moaning, his small body convulsing. A soldier rushed forward and fired point blank into his skull. The boy's head snapped back, and he lay still at last. The daughters, still alive, were finished with bayonets, stabbed again and again until their cries ceased. Their blood spread across the stone floor, mingling, pooling, staining the boots of their killers. It lasted minutes, though it felt an eternity. When the smoke cleared, when the shouts and curses faded, the room was silent but for the drip of blood. The Romanovs, once the anointed rulers of all Russia, lay in a heap of broken flesh upon the cellar floor, their crowns reduced to corpses. I stood frozen, unable to move, my body shaking. My mind screamed prayers, but no words came. I had thought myself ready for tragedy, hardened by years of captivity, but nothing could have prepared me for the horror of that night. I had known them as children laughing in gardens, as parents praying by candlelight, as human beings clinging to one another in the darkness. And now they were meat, hacked and riddled with bullets, their eyes staring glassy into nothing. The executioners set to work swiftly, stripping the bodies, gathering them onto carts, cursing the blood that stained their hands. I was ordered away, yet my eyes clung to the sight of Anastasia's hair, matted with blood, of Nicholas's hand still clutching the cross he had carried into the room. They dragged them into the night, into the forest, to pits already dug. The empire of 300 years was reduced to ash and silence in less than an hour. When the doors closed, when the cellar was empty save for the stench of death, I fell to my knees. I do not know how long I remained there, weeping, praying to a God who had remained silent throughout. That night was not merely the death of a family. It was the death of an idea, the execution of a myth that had held Russia for centuries. That the Romanovs were eternal, chosen, divine. The bullets shattered more than flesh. They shattered faith. And yet, paradoxically, in their brutal ending, they became more eternal than ever. Martyrs in the eyes of some, ghosts in the eyes of others, left the cellar alive. But a part of me remained there, trapped among the bodies, forever a servant to the dead. Years have passed since that night in the cellar, yet I carry it still, as though the smell of gunpowder and blood has clung to my skin. The world has changed beyond recognition. The banners of red now fly over palaces, where once golden eagles soared. The voices of the revolution echo in streets that once rang with hymns for the Tsar. And the Romanovs, my masters, my family by duty, if not by blood, exist only in memory, in whispers, in the shadows of history. But I, a simple servant, remain their witness. What remains with me most is not the politics, not the rhetoric of the Bolsheviks, nor the speeches of generals or ministers. It is the small moments, the fragile humanity. Alexandra's trembling, hands clutching her icon each night. Nicholas chopping wood in the yard of captivity, his breath fogging in the cold air, still dignified in his silence. Olga reading psalms in a steady voice to soothe her mother's fear. Anastasia's mischievous grin, flashing even in the gloom of imprisonment. Alexei's laughter, frail but bright, echoing through the barred windows like a spark in endless dark. These fragments, more than crowns or treaties, were what truly made them royal. History has not been kind to Nicholas II. They call him weak, indecisive, blind to his people's suffering. And perhaps he was. I am no scholar to dispute it. But I knew him as a father, as a man who kissed his children's foreheads, who bore humiliation without complaint, who carried his downfall with quiet dignity. Alexandra is remembered as a hysteric, obsessed with Rasputin, deaf to her empire's cries. And perhaps she was. Yet I knew her as a mother, whose love was fierce, whose faith was desperate, who clung to the only hope she could find for her son. History flattens, distorts, simplifies. But I remember the texture of their humanity, the softness of their voices, the frailty of their hearts. The world believes the Romanovs died because they were symbols of tyranny, of wealth, of divine right. And perhaps that too is true. But in that cellar, when the rifles roared, they were not symbols. They were simply a family, huddled together, clinging to one another in terror, as any family would. Their deaths were meant to erase them, to sever the past from the present, to bury 300 years of monarchy beneath gunfire and earth. But in truth, the opposite happened. Their blood consecrated them. They became martyrs in the eyes of many, saints in the prayers of the faithful, ghosts that haunt Russia still. For me, there is no escape from their memory. I dream of them nightly, not as rulers on thrones, but as captives in dim rooms, as children, stitching their own dresses, as a boy coughing into his mother's arms. I survived, but survival is not mercy, it is obligation. I live to carry their story, to speak of what I saw, so that the world will know they were more than a dynasty. They were human, and it was their humanity that was extinguished that night, more brutally than crowns or scepters could ever signify. And so I reflect on what their fall means. It is the truth that no power, no throne, no lineage is eternal. Even the mightiest can be dragged into a cellar and silenced by bullets. Yet it is also true that death cannot erase memory. In killing them, their enemies made them eternal. Their shadows still walk with us, reminding us of faith lost, of blood spilled, of the fragility of all empires. I am but a servant, nameless to history. But I was there. And as long as I breathe, the Romanovs are not wholly gone. For I carry them in grief, in memory, in the silence that follows gunfire.